As I indicated already, we are doing the study of A Case for Christmas. Anybody not know who Lee Strobel is? And it's okay if you don't, because I want to share with you a little bit about Lee. So let me share with you now. He wrote this book as well as several other best-selling books. Case for Christ, Case for Faith, A Case for Easter, And what it is, and it sort of goes hand in hand with where we've been over the last month or so, it's sort of an apologetic book or a defense of Christianity. And let me read with you. I came across an article that sort of described Lee, and I thought I'd share it with you all tonight to give you a little bit of background. Because even if you've heard of him, you may not be familiar with exactly who he is or what he's done or what his background is. So let me share with you a little bit about it as this author in this article wrote. Here's what the author writes. It says, if God says he loves you, check it out. With the training of a newspaper legal affairs reporter, Lee Strobel spent 2 years investigating that very claim, concluding that it boiled down to one central question. Did Jesus or did he not return from the dead? Lee Strobel's the best-selling author of The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith, told his story of coming to belief Monday night at GCU Arena. Strobel's pursuit of a satisfactory answer led him to a number of scholars, both believers and non-believers, and eventually to a career as a Christian author and teacher. So you know what he came up with, but what you may not know is that he was a hard case. Strobel was an avowed atheist, convinced that people created God because they were afraid of death. And his hedonistic lifestyle revealed no spiritual inclinations whatsoever. He writes, I lived an immoral, drunken, profane, narcissistic, self-destructive kind of life, as he addressed the crowd with those words. Although he was an award-winning journalist for the Chicago Tribune, he had a mess of a life, saying that his young daughter feared his arrival home from work. When his wife Leslie was befriended by a Christian woman in their condo building and made a decision to accept Christ, Strobel wasn't impressed, but he figured he had nothing to lose by accompanying her to church one Sunday. The service was in a movie theater. The preacher was Bill Hybels. The topic was basic Christianity. And Strobel left with a lot on his mind. If this is true, he told himself, it has huge implications for my life. The ground had been laid for his fact-finding project, and ultimately his life of proclaiming the gospel and defending the faith. Strobel now is 61 years old and went on to become a teaching pastor for 13 years at Hybels Church, Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago. And he's written a number of best-selling books, as we've already described. Strobel hasn't lost the everyday sensibility of a reporter, as he demonstrated in his hour-long talk that was entertaining and engaging and challenging. You don't have to buy my books. You can get them free at the library, he said. And if you don't believe in God, that's perfectly okay as long as you check it out. You owe it to yourself to investigate the evidence. He carefully took the audience through what he called the 4 E's that provide such evidence of Jesus' resurrection. Execution, early accounts, the empty tomb, and the eyewitnesses. I realized it would take more faith for me in the end to remain an atheist than to become a Christian, he said, adding that his journey still wasn't complete until he accepted for himself this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life. The fact of the matter is, Lee Strobel, and if you read other articles about him, set out to prove Christianity was a fraud. It doesn't say that, but that's what he set out to do. He was a journalist. He had a legal background as a lawyer, and his whole contention was, I will prove that it's a fraud, that my wife is believing in something that's not real. And after he set out and he went through all the process, he came to the conclusion that it is real. and that Christianity is not a fraud. And he's written any number of books and documentation of that. As I said, there is a best-selling book, and there actually is a movie. If you get a chance, I think that we watched a movie probably about 6 months. Must have been on something, maybe on Amazon Prime or whatever. It's called A Case for Christ, and it's his life story, and it's a pretty powerful story about the life of Lee Strobel. So if you get a chance and you want to know more about Lee, that'd be a good place to start because you can actually watch it, and I think you'll be moved by it. So Lee, in introducing this study, A Case for Christmas, posed that we ask a couple of questions just to kind of get the minds working, and thinking about maybe about Christmas. And I know I hate to ever start anything about Christmas before Thanksgiving, but we only have X amount of Wednesdays, and so there's 4 sessions, and they'll work out that we have to start 1 week early. So the first question he poses, just for starters, is what's your favorite Christmas movie? Anybody want to share? Your favorite Christmas movie? A Christmas Carol. Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. That is the Alistair, yeah. That's my wife's favorite too. We watch that every year. Anybody else want to share? Yeah, you would. I knew somebody would have to say Die Hard or Gremlins or, and to be honest, we have a list in our house of about 20 Christmas movies, and neither of those movies made the cut. But that's okay. If that's your idea of a Christmas movie, that speaks more volumes about you, Malachi, than it does. No, I'm kidding. What do you got, Julio? The animated Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Yeah, my granddaughter loves that. Yeah, that's a good one. Anybody else? A favorite Christmas movie? Oh, Christmas Vacation. It's not one of my favorites, but I do count that on my list, Joe. It's a different slant. So that's your favorite too. Betty has White Christmas, and that's one of our favorites. As a matter of fact, we watch White Christmas every Christmas Eve after the candlelight service here. We go home and watch White Christmas, or at least the first third of it, and then we fall asleep usually watching it, and then we go to bed and watch the rest of it tomorrow, the day after. But Charlie Brown. Okay, so we're kind of thinking, in many Christmas movies, I think what we'll find is, and certainly in A Christmas Carol, certainly in The Grinch, which nobody mentioned, maybe Die Hard, but that'd be a stretch. But there is sort of this idea of repentance in many of them, turning your life around. I don't know whether Bruce Willis actually does that, but at some level I suppose he does. But I'd have to dig real deep for a theological theme in Die Hard. But I'll give it some thought, just for you, Malcolm. But in any event, those are, I think it's sort of fun, and that's why 2 of the studies I purchased were on movies, because there often are these theological themes that are connected with Christmas movies, whether it be It's a Wonderful Life and the George Bailey story, or whether it be A Christmas Carol, The Grinch, Christmas with the Cranks. Again, we see a sort of change of I'm sorry? Yeah, The Grinch That Stole Christmas, absolutely. So, okay, so we got our minds working a little bit. Question number 2 he asks is, what is your family's tradition concerning the opening of Christmas gifts? Do you do it on Christmas? Do you do it Christmas Eve? Do you do it one person at a time? Do you, how do you do that sort of thing? For those who have kids or had kids, I mean, you still have kids, but not in house. It can be more challenging. Right. Okay. There you go. You go around the circle. Everybody opens one. There you go. There you go. Okay. Well, good. stay up all night. And then they wake up at 5 in the morning and you'd only been in bed for 10 minutes, Joe, right? All right, let me move on because I don't want to get hung up on his preliminary questions too much to just kind of get us thinking Christmas a little bit. But the final question he asks is, do you have a nativity scene you put up in your home? Okay, anybody have a nativity scene? Anybody? Do you, because it's a two-parter, okay? Second part of the question is, what would the scene look like if you took away the stable and the wise men? What would it look like if there was no stable there and no wise men? And the animals. Okay. Yeah, it takes on a little different look, and every year, on Epiphany, I say, well, and I used to have a youth pastor at my last church who always made me put the wise men on the windowsill, like way far away from the nativity, because he said they're still about a year or two away. They're way far off. They're not anywhere near the scene yet. But yeah, it would give a different look, and that's one of the things that Lee Strobel is going to address in tonight's study. Is some of the things that we sort of associate as factual about the Christmas story. Maybe there's some things we need to contemplate. And not that they necessarily change the meaning of Christmas, but it may help us understand better, the specifics, and help us, therefore, be able to explain to others when they come up with these arguments against Christmas. Help us explain maybe more thoroughly the reality of it. One final question before we go to our video tonight, though, and these were my questions now. I know Advent is still 10 days away, right? Advent starts, it lasts for 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. But what does Advent mean to you? It's still about 10 days off, but hey, it's good to talk about it now. Again, this is an Advent study. What does it even mean to you when you hear the word Advent? Or when you go through the process of the season of Advent, what does it mean to you? Do you even give it a thought? It's okay if you don't. I'm just asking. Maybe you don't really think about it all that much in terms of that aspect of it. Right. So they didn't celebrate Advent. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, depending upon your tradition, that could very well be the case. But let me just share with you, a little bit about Advent before we watch our video tonight. Just to give you some historical background of what Advent is really, where it came from, what it's about, at least in theory. The name Advent actually comes from the Latin word adventus, which means coming. Okay? That's what the word means, coming. It was given to this time of year in late November into December because Christians are waiting for the coming of Jesus Christ. So Advent is about the coming of Jesus Christ, who they believe is the Messiah and the Son of God. The season is traditionally seen to be a time of waiting expectantly and happily, if you will, and preparing for the Christmas season that will take place with the celebration culminating with the celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ on December 25th. It's also a reminder of how the Jewish nation waited for the Messiah and how we as Christians are now waiting for the Messiah to return. We are waiting for the return of Jesus Christ. Literally, it means coming or arrival of something, and something important usually, like the advent of a computer. The advent of the computer, talks about the coming of the computer when it came to be. So, began to put into practice about the 4th century. It actually, back then, the 4th century was a period of time leading up to Epiphany. Advent was at that when it was first originated, because Epiphany was a time when they actually baptized new believers. And so it was time of preparing for the baptism of new believers, teaching, prepping them for the actual act of baptism. However, in about the 6th century, through the church in Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, it sort of began to become associated with the birth of Jesus Christ, and has been since then. And now it's about preparing for the celebration of his first coming and looking towards the anticipation of his triumphant return. So that's kind of just a little bit of background, focusing on what's important. That's what Advent is about. It's not about, it takes maybe our focus away from the cookies and the shopping and the Christmas movies and, which are all good things. None of that's bad, but keeps our focus on what's really important, Jesus Christ. And so that's sort of just a little bit of background pertaining to Advent itself. As we now, I'm going to turn to, I got more pages on that, but that's enough about Advent. I don't want to steal all of Elise Strobel's thunder here this evening. So with that, I'm going to see if Peter can pull up our video tonight. We'll see what you find interesting, because I think I found this interesting, and, I'm the pastor, so I hope you do too.
Even when I was an atheist, I loved Christmas time because I managed to focus on all the superficial trappings of the holiday instead of the spiritual dimension. What's not to like about Christmas? You got gift giving, you've got holiday parties, you get cards from relatives and friends. I was like anybody else. I loved sitting by the warm fireplace, sipping on some hot chocolate, or back in those days, probably something a little more potent, and enjoying time with family and relatives and friends. I think lots of people like me just enjoy the sentimental side of the season. In fact, many of my atheist buddies would rank the Christmas season as one of their favorite times of the year. But after my wife Leslie became a Christian, and I started to investigate the identity of Jesus, I began to probe into the real meaning of those nativity scenes that I'd see outside of churches. I wanted to separate the holiday from the holy day, the facts from the fantasy, the truth from the tradition, and get down to the historic bedrock of what Christmas is all about. What I found thoroughly fascinated me. I expected to discover that Christmas is built on flimsy legends that developed in the many decades after Jesus lived. I thought the virgin birth would be exposed as some sort of fanciful idea that was plagiarized from earlier mythology. I didn't anticipate that the opposite would happen, that a thorough investigation of the ancient history would validate the Christmas narrative, because it's based on reliable sources that are too immediate to be written off as being mere legend or make-believe. So I'd like to share some of what I learned with you. I'm so glad that you're joining me for this 4-week experience as we set aside Santa Claus and Christmas trees and delve instead into the question of what we can really know with confidence about the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a journey that I'm convinced will stimulate your mind, it'll warm your heart, it'll satisfy your soul, and forever, I believe it will change the way that you celebrate Christmas. It is, after all, the greatest story of history. And as you know, the greatest stories of history are the ones that turn out to be true. When we investigate Christmas, we not only have to separate the commercial aspects of Christmas from the spiritual roots of the holiday, but we also need to drill down deeply into the historical record to determine exactly what did take place in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. Because sometimes we find that legends have contaminated the actual account of what really took place. Let me give you an example. Here's the storyline we typically hear at Christmas, even in many of our churches. To comply with a census being conducted by the Roman Emperor Augustus, Joseph and the pregnant Mary set out on a donkey to go to Bethlehem, since Joseph was a descendant from the house of David. The baby starts to arrive as they approach the village, so they urgently are seeking shelter. But the mean old innkeeper tells them there's no vacancy. That is, there's no room for them at the inn. And this forces Mary and Joseph into a nearby stable or cave where Mary gives birth amongst the animals. The child is then wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed in a manger. Sounds familiar, right? And yet, as I investigated Christmas, I found that that's probably not exactly what happened in terms of how Luke describes the real Christmas. First, it would have been unthinkable in the first century for anyone to turn away a pregnant Jewish woman who was seeking shelter. I mean, hospitality was such an extremely high value in those days. In fact, one scholar said, to turn away a descendant of David in the city of David would be an unspeakable shame on the entire village. The person who turned her away would be ostracized from the community. Second, and I'm sorry if I pop any bubbles or meddle with any Christmas carols here, but there was probably no inn and probably no innkeeper. Yeah, there were some commercial lodgings that were available in the first century, but probably not in Bethlehem. It was a small community and it wasn't on a major road. Besides, many scholars doubt whether Luke is talking about a hotel at all. You see, the Greek word that many Bibles translate as inn is katalima. This word is used twice in the New Testament, where Luke and Mark describe the place where the Last Supper was held. Now, in that instance, the word clearly means a spare or upper room in a private house. Now, if Luke had wanted to describe a commercial lodging of some sort, he had another Greek word he certainly would have used. But he didn't use that other Greek word. He did when he told the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. But here, Luke specifically chose the word katalima to talk about the birth of Jesus. And katalima is best translated as guest room. In fact, the NIV Bible translates Luke 2, verse 7, as saying that Mary gave birth, wrapped Jesus in cloths, and placed him in a manger, quote, because there was no guest room available for them. Many scholars say this is the most accurate translation. In fact, as far back as the year 1395, John Wycliffe's translation of Luke 2, verse 7, rendered katalima as a chamber or a room, not some sort of commercial inn. But then subsequent translations, for some reason, and that includes the King James Version, use the word inn, and that's become part of our Christmas culture. Now, in his book, Urban Legends of the New Testament, scholar David Croteau describes how first century homes looked in the Middle East. There was generally one large room broken down into two parts. There was the family room, where cooking and eating and sleeping took place. And then there were a few steps down to the animal room, where the family donkey, cow, and a sheep or two would be kept. Now, these animals were brought inside the last thing at night, and they're taken outside the first thing in the morning. Now, this floor in the animal room was slanted toward the outside for easy cleaning. But sometimes the larger animals would come up the stairs into the family room. And so each area had its own manger or feeding trough, which was usually built into the floor and filled with hay for the animals to eat. Now, here's the thing. Some houses added a second room off the family room, which was called the guest room, and it would have had its own exterior entrance. This was the katalima that Luke was referring to. There was no room for Mary and Joseph in the katalima, the guest room. What's more, Mary apparently wasn't on the verge of giving birth as she and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem. This idea can be traced back to an apocryphal work of fiction called the Protevangelium of James, which is from the 2nd century. It's a work that doesn't have any connection to James, who was a half-brother of Jesus, or James the Apostle. It's mostly legendary stuff. Again, we have to pay close attention to what Luke reports, since he was writing much closer to the events after interviewing eyewitnesses. In fact, Luke says in the prologue of his gospel that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning so he could write an orderly account of the certainty of what took place. Well, Luke chapter 2, verse 6 says that, quote, the time for the baby to be born came, quote, while they were there in Bethlehem. Luke doesn't portray this as being an urgent or emergency situation that occurred as they were approaching the village. As one scholar said, he doesn't mention whether they were there for 5 minutes or 5 weeks, but it could allow for both. In other words, there was probably no panic involved. Oh, and one more thing. What about the idea that Mary gave birth in a cave? Actually, the Gospels don't mention a cave at all. In fact, the idea of a cave can be traced back to Christian apologist Justin Martyr, who was writing much later. He was writing in the middle of the 2nd century. So, what really happened on that first Christmas? Well, Joseph and the pregnant Mary arrived in Bethlehem to register for the census. They went to the house of a friend or a relative, but there was no room for them in the guest room, probably because of the crowd of people who'd already arrived for the census. So they were invited to stay in their family room, where Mary gave birth, and the child was placed in the clean hay of a feeding trough, where he was subsequently encountered by the shepherds who had been alerted to his birth by the angels. Now, these are, I think, fascinating details, but the bottom line truth of Christmas remains unchanged. Jesus gave up his throne in heaven to enter into our world as a baby lying in a manger. Now, it's a legitimate question to ask whether we can trust the gospel accounts. How do we know they're telling us the truth? How do we know that they're reliable? Can we be sure that they're trustworthy when they describe the birth, the teachings, the death, and ultimately the resurrection of Jesus? Well, I started out as a skeptic, but I eventually emerged convinced that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are accurate in what they tell us about Jesus. After all, each of these fall within the historical genre of ancient biographies, which were intended, to one degree or another, to report what actually took place in the life of a notable person. And as I've demonstrated in my books, these Gospels bear the earmarks of accuracy. First, they were written a lot closer to the events they describe than some of the critics claim. How do we know? Well, let's consider the Gospel of Luke, which has the most details about the birth of Jesus. Luke was a physician and close companion of the Apostle Paul. Scholars agree that he wrote the book of Acts, which describes the early spread of Christianity. But the book ends unfinished because its central figure, Paul, is under house arrest in Rome. Now, we don't find out from Acts what happens to Paul. And beyond that, Acts doesn't describe several other major events that happened in the AD 60s, like the martyrdom of Peter and James, and the Roman-Greco War, and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. So, Acts was apparently written before those events occurred, meaning that we can date it before about AD 62. Now, we know that Acts is the second of a two-part work written by Luke, the earlier one being the Gospel of Luke. So we can date the Gospel of Luke to around AD 60, or perhaps a little bit earlier. Now, keep in mind that Jesus was killed in AD 30 or 33. So we're talking about a very short time gap. And we know that one of Luke's sources was Mark. So his gospel is even earlier. Now, this dating is especially significant when you consider that one of the greatest historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford University, determined that in the ancient world, the passage of 2 generations of time was not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. And yet, Luke's gospel was written within the same generation when Jesus lived. A second reason we can trust the Gospels is that archaeology has consistently affirmed the biblical record, to the point where Luke has been described by scholars as a first-rate historian. In fact, sometimes skeptics have believed that Luke was wrong about something, only to have later discoveries prove that, well, Luke was right after all. Let me just give you an example. Luke says that after Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, he grew up in Nazareth. Yet, skeptics claim for years that Nazareth didn't even exist in the first century. They cite the fact that Nazareth isn't mentioned in the Old Testament, it's not mentioned by the Apostle Paul or in the Jewish Talmud. In fact, no historians mention it before the beginning of the 4th century. However, in 2006, the Nazareth Archaeological Project began excavating beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent. And guess what they found? A house from the era of Jesus. What's more, inside they discovered limestone vessels, which Jews believed could not become impure. Now, what does this suggest? This suggests this was a Jewish home right there in Nazareth from Jesus' era. 3 years later, guess what happened? Another house from Jesus' days was unearthed nearby. Once again, Luke was shown to have been exactly correct. Nazareth did exist in Jesus' day. So, there are good reasons to trust Luke and the other Gospels as well when they tell us about Jesus. But then, why don't Mark and John describe the birth of Jesus? Some skeptics have said that the absence of a birth narrative in those 2 Gospels, as well as in the writings of the Apostle Paul, undermines the historical record about how Jesus entered the world. But this, friends, is an argument from silence. And arguments from silence are notoriously unconvincing. Not all the Gospels report each and every event in Jesus' life. In fact, John, being the last Gospel that was written, doesn't repeat a lot of the material that was already known in the earlier Gospels, including the Sermon on the Mount. Yet, interestingly, someone who tradition tells us was personally mentored by John the Apostle surely emerged believing in the virgin birth. His name was Ignatius, and he became the bishop of Antioch. Now, in the year AD 108, he wrote a letter in which he explicitly says that Jesus was, quote, truly born of a virgin. Now, where did he learn that from? Could it be that he learned it from his mentor, the author of the Gospel of John? As for Mark, he simply doesn't deal with Jesus' early years in his gospel. That's a literary choice he made. However, he does implicitly reference the unusual nature of Jesus' birth when he quotes someone in Mark 6, verse 3, as referring to Jesus as, quote, the Son of Mary. Now, normally, a Jewish person would be identified with his father's name, even if his dad were deceased. But here we have an implicit acknowledgement that Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus. Something was unusual about his birth. As for why the Apostle Paul doesn't mention the circumstances of Jesus' birth, the answer is that it simply wasn't relevant to the issues that prompted him to write the epistles. Besides, Paul doesn't mention a lot of details about Jesus that are already covered in the Gospels. For instance, he never mentions Mary or Joseph or Nazareth. So, are we to presume they didn't exist? Of course not. So, what have we learned so far? That the historical record of the birth of Jesus needs to be taken seriously. The Gospels are our best source about what really took place 2,000 years ago when Jesus was born to a virgin named Mary. If it were all a fairy tale, akin to Santa Claus and elves, we could dismiss it as merely being, a childhood fantasy without any practical implications for our lives. But because it's true, Christmas cannot be ignored. In the end, the child in the manger deserves our allegiance, and he deserves our worship. I'm struck in the end by the humility displayed by Jesus in his birth. Here he is, the eternal God who created the entire universe. And as John 1 verse 14 says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He entered into our world in the most primitive and unpretentious way. As Philippians 2:7 describes it, Christ Jesus made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And that should tell you and me that whatever our circumstances, no matter how modest, no matter how dire, no matter how difficult, Jesus offers to enter into our world and to bring his grace and his truth into our individual situation. As Christian author Philip Yancey put it, as I read the birth stories about Jesus, I cannot help but conclude that though the world may be tilted toward the rich and powerful, God is tilted toward the underdog. If you haven't invited Jesus into your life, or if you haven't turned over your worries or your problems to him, then I hope that by the end of this study, that you will. Believe me, that would make this the best Christmas of all.
All right, you now not only have heard of Lee Strobel, but you've seen him. Good night, Natasha. Any initial thoughts from viewing it? Why is that? I mean, how so? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the reality is, as I said before, this is a man who didn't want to believe. He didn't want to believe, but he methodically did the research and believed once he saw the evidence. And I think that's all he asks anybody to do in his books, in his writings, in his teaching. How many of you have either heard or believe even that Jesus was refused at an inn? Certainly we almost all heard it, whether you thought that was the literal truth. We've heard it, right? I mean, we've had dramas here at the church where we had the innkeeper do a dramatic reading. So, I mean, we've all sort of had that ideology. Yeah, well, and again, this is sort of the factual type of research. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and again, what he's saying is, if you want to look at the word Catalina and look at it as in, that is one possible interpretation. But there's a better word for in that Luke uses somewhere else when he literally means in. So again, this is the way he investigates from a factual perspective. That doesn't make sense necessarily to look at it as a literal in. And so the whole guest room does make sense because it is used in that context in another place in the Bible at the Last Supper. The word is used for the guest room. So it makes sense. And does it change anything about the story? No, it doesn't necessarily change it. But it so what does it mean to you and I? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It makes it more real. For people who are skeptics, it makes it, wow, that makes sense, right? Not this dramatic sense of somebody coming to a door that's pregnant, about to give birth, and they're turned away, and not that there's anything wrong with people who believe that. I'm not criticizing anybody, but from a real life perspective, it now all of a sudden says, wow, I can see that. I can see that happening that way for someone who doesn't believe. It takes away maybe one of those arrows that they might have from a skeptical perspective, as well as this idea that Joseph and Mary could have been in town for 5 minutes or for 5 weeks, because the Bible doesn't say that she immediately went into labor, or as they were approaching the city gates, that she went into labor. As they were there, she went into labor. Was it 5 minutes? Was it 5 weeks? Does it matter? Not really. But again, it's one of those things that says, takes away some of, how did you describe it, Malachi? Yeah, the mist. Wow, you got those big words. I love that. I'm going to have you sit right up here next to me, Malachi. But it doesn't make a big difference to you and I, does it? As believers, it doesn't change the story. But to a non-believer, it can be something that all of a sudden says, oh, yeah, never thought of it that way. So I think that is also significant. As we look to the reliability of Scripture, and we've looked at this at some depth over the last month or so, because we've been looking at the Bible and how trustworthy it is. But as he talks about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the Gospels, why should any differences in their approach or lack thereof concerning the birth of Jesus cause us concern about the trustworthiness, or why shouldn't it, as he would describe? Okay. Could depend on the background, the education of the writer. Okay. Some might emphasize one thing over another thing. Obviously the Gospel of John significantly different than the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why Luke? Why such detail in Luke? He was a doctor. In some ways, when I think of Luke and his background, I see a connection between him and Lee Strobel, right? These are educated men who researched thoroughly what had happened. They researched because they wanted what they were about to write or tell the public or tell the world was true and trustworthy. Luke says that. I mean, in his whole introduction, he goes to great lengths to say, hey, I researched this. I went to eyewitnesses who were there, who saw, who witnessed Jesus, his birth, his life, his resurrection. And so while these others may not have taken the exact same approach, Luke's background, as you say, Joe, I think probably led him to that sort of approach that would be more encompassing. Yes? Yeah. And you know, the Gospel of Matthew kind of gives us this broad overview of the birth of Jesus, right? In the beginning of Matthew, whereas Luke is the one who goes into great detail. It's because who Luke was, I think, right? Because of what he wanted to accomplish through his gospel. What, having seen and heard tonight's lesson, do you take from it? What's the most important thing you take from this teaching? That's something you never thought about, heard, or... Yeah. So to you, it adds credibility to the story. Okay. Anybody? What's the most important thing you took from this? Julio. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't alter any of the facts or any of the reality for you and I. Yeah. Malachi. And I think that's, you know, as I've gone through the preparation and begun to look at it, that's where I think the greatest value for you and I is in this study. We've got an individual who wants to give us the tools and ammunition to be able to go out there and share the truth of Jesus Christ and the story of Christmas with others in a way that they can understand, maybe relate to in some way, and respond to. Because isn't that what it's all about in the end, right? You know, sharing in a way that people will respond, that they too will hear this good news and trust in it, believe in it. Yeah, Malachi. Right. Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. Chris, you know, we know historically that people are more receptive to the good news of Jesus Christ, both at Christmas and at Easter. Those are times where people are thinking about it. Whether they believe it or not, they're at least thinking about it. It's out there. It's on their minds. There'll be magazine covers with Jesus on it, or with the Jesus in the manger, or you know. So people, it's there, and you know, hopefully, we have the opportunity to tell people about it, you know, and this will provide us with some of the tools to do that. Any other thoughts in closing? Because it's 8 o'clock. We will not meet next week because it is the night before Thanksgiving, and you all probably cooking your turkeys or doing whatever you're going to do the night before Thanksgiving. But we will meet 2 weeks from tonight, and that'll allow us 3 weeks, 3 Wednesdays leading up to Christmas. So we will take it 1 week at a time. And I did not read the scripture tonight, although Lee covered much of it, and that's one of the reasons I handed it out. If you wanted to reference what he was saying versus what the Gospel of Luke says. So if you want to sort of reference that and maybe even bring it along next time, because that's going to be the central core, obviously, of our discussion as we go forward.